All right. We have a good bit to cover today. And so we'll get going. Just a little bit of an update on the rest of our schedule. We will take this study through the end of May. And we mapped out everything that kind of cover what we're going to cover for the next 4 or 5 weeks. And then starting in June for the summer, Curtis Williams is going to be teaching. Do we have a subject yet from him?
I'm not 100% sure, so I'll wait until we know for sure.
Subject to be confirmed, but he'll do the summer, and then we'll figure out where we go into the fall. But we've got about 5 more weeks of this study, and just again, shameless plug. Tour to Turkey this summer to look at how the early church grew and spread. Still have room. I think the price is holding with the airfares. So if you're interested, it's not too late to sign up. It's going to be a good group of folks. And you can go to my website to find out more information, steppingintothejordan.com. And then if you go to this file, which should be posted on Wednesday, there will be a direct link in the file that you can look at. We are going to look at 2 women in Genesis that function completely within patriarchy. But I think how they function may be a little surprising when we look at how they function. And for this lesson, we're going to do a brief review of patriarchy in a minute. Much of what I'm doing, I've taken from 2 different books. One I've put up before, The Social World of Ancient Israel by Victor Matthews and Don Benjamin. It's a really good resource that tries to explain what the ancient world looked like and how we might miss some of those things in the Bible. And then another book that takes a very completely different approach to the text is by Phyllis Tribble, who we've talked about before. But this is her second book. The first one we looked at we looked at some of what she did with God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality was the name of the book. This is her more well-known book. It's called Texts of Terror. And it examines a series of women in the Bible, mostly in the Old Testament, from the perspective of terror and how they are subjected to terror. And needless to say, these 2 authors take quite different views of the texts we're going to look at today, but I find value in both of them. And I don't necessarily agree with either of them on every point, but I find things from each of them that I actually appreciate. So anyway, that's we'll get more into that in a second. Before we do that, we need to do a little bit of a review of patriarchy in the Bible, as opposed to how we think of patriarchy in our world today, because they're a little bit different. The ancient world is first and foremost a communal world. Self-identity, your personal identity, is secondary to your family identity. And your identity comes from the father's household. Okay, the Beit Av is what that's called in Hebrew. And that life begins at adoption, not at birth. And the survival of the family on their land was everyone's primary concern. And in the Old Testament, that's about as close as the text ever gets to talking about eternal life, is the continuation of your family living on their land that God gave to them. Okay? And that within that household structure, the father, the head of the household, has certain rights and roles and responsibilities. First and foremost is to protect and provide for his land and children. He's authorized as the father of the household to adopt or excommunicate sons or daughters, recruit workers and warriors, negotiate marriages and covenant contracts with other families and households, to host strangers, and to designate heirs. And in fact, the husband that we're going to look at today is one that does all of those things. He kind of is the prototype model for the father of the father's household. However, the mother of the household, and by that I mean the primary wife, has responsibilities as well. And those also include to protect and provide for the land and the children as the primary directive. That she has the responsibility and the role to bear children and arrange for other wives to bear children. To manage the household by supervising domestic production, rationing, and food production. She's a teacher of the clan traditions. She mediates domestic conflicts, and she designates heirs. And a few weeks ago, we saw how Rebecca actually works to designate the heir, to select Jacob over Esau, because under Esau, the family probably would have died. So, with that in mind, we're going to look at Sarah and Hagar. So we have to set the scene first, because there's some things that happen just before this story that are worthwhile for us to remember. And that happens in Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. So it starts with after these things, which what has happened is, if you recall, Lot gets captured and taken away, and Abraham musters an army and goes after the people that took him to bring him back. And we get the whole strange, weird scene with Melchizedek. Too much to talk about there. But after all those things, we get this in chapter 15. And he says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, you have given me no offspring, and no slave born in my house is to be, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, this man shall not be your heir, no one but your very own issue shall be your heir. He brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. So my question is, this is actually the second time Abraham has received a promise to God from God about he's going to make him into a great nation. My question is, how long has it been since God made that original promise to Abraham? How much time has passed? And remember, Abraham was an old man when this all started. Anybody know? It's been around 10 years. 10 years after the promise, nada. Nothing. And so you can kind of not blame Abram for the fact that he's saying, look, I continue to be childless. Okay? You made me this promise, and here we sit. And oh, by the way, I just risked my life going off in a battle to save my nephew in this land that you brought us to, where you made me this promise, right? Come on, the clock's ticking. Okay? Some would say the batteries are dead. Okay? And so, with that as a backdrop, here's the very next thing we see. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. So my question is, how do you see those patriarchal roles that we just talked about playing out in this narrative?
You're trying to extend the family?
Okay. And who is making the...
Sarah.
So is Sarah within her rights to do this?
Yes.
Absolutely.
It's not just her right to do it.
Ah.
She feels like it's her obligation.
It's her obligation to do it. Okay. There's something else I want to point out here that is kind of interesting. Notice the words highlighted in yellow there. So, we often say that biblical Hebrew is a word-poor language, which is true in some cases. So, we don't know exactly how big the vocabulary was that Israelites spoke. All we have left of the language is what's in the Bible. And it's a fairly limited vocabulary. I think it's about 4,000 words. What's interesting, though, is in some areas it's very non-specific. So, for example, there is one word for big body of water. Okay? It could be an ocean, it could be a big lake. Okay? It's the same word. The Sea of Galilee, for example, is called a sea. It's called Yam. In Hebrew, it's not very big. I imagine Lake Grapevine is bigger. It's like 8 miles by 6 miles. The Mediterranean Sea, same word. Probably because Israelites were desert people. You don't need a lot of words to describe big water. However, there's about 5 words to describe different kinds of desert. There's 4 words that describe different kinds of valleys that are all very specific. There's 3 words and maybe 4 that describe different roles for women. Okay? So the fact that it uses the word wife here for Hagar is very specific. It's not the only word available. There's words for secondary wives or for concubines. It's a different word. Here she's called a wife. Let's read on. Then Sarah said to Abram, this is after Hagar has looked down on her. Incidentally, what does Hagar mean? Does anybody know? I suspect it probably isn't her real name. It means foreign thing. The foreign one. A ger, G-E-R, or gar, ger, is a foreigner. Ha is the, so it's the foreign one. Sarah said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abraham said to Sarah, "Your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarah dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. Now, does anything seem odd to you here?
Sounds like a normal conversation between a man and a woman.
Especially if There's a third.
Did she take the baby?
Hmm?
I know
Say-
when she ran away, did she take the baby with her?
Yeah, the baby's not born yet. Baby's not born yet.
That's what I know.
Now,
What seems odd to me is that, and he's stating that she is her property, yet he took her as his wife.
yeah, is Hagar a wife or a slave?
Yeah.
Do they have a wedding? They have a wedding.
The dynamics are really weird here. This is it's problematic here. What is she? What is her status? Okay? And she's run away. Wow. Can she do that if she's a slave?
Really, she can't do it either way.
Oh,
Wife
well,
or
that's a
slave.
question. Can she do it either way? Well,
She's property, whether she's a female, she's property.
okay. So Matthews and Benjamin in their book have an interesting take on this. They say that what happens here is that this is what's called a trial by ordeal in the desert. And basically by going out into the desert like she does, and given that the language that Sarah has about, let the Lord decide between you and me who's right here, the idea is that by sending her into the desert under this ordeal, that God will decide who should be the primary woman of the household. Is it Hagar or is it Sarah? And that if Hagar survives, then God sides with her. And if Hagar dies, then God has sided with Sarah. I'll be honest, I'm a little skeptical of this view. But they bring out an interesting point as to why she goes out into the desert. And also we're going to see her go out into the desert a second time, okay, in just a little while. But it raises the question about, what's going on here in this text. And why does she run away to the desert as opposed to go someplace else? So, Hagar's in the desert, and it says the angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave girl of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I am running away from my mistress Sarah. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. Now, that's a really bad translation, what I've highlighted in yellow. Earlier when it said that Sarah oppressed her, it's the same word here, return to her to be oppressed. Okay? And so my question then is, if this is a trial by ordeal, who wins? Does Sarah win or does Hagar win?
Hagar would have to win, I think, just to secure the lifeline of the bloodline of thing.
Okay. In some sense, you can look at this and say Hagar wins. But she wins through being oppressed. But that's not where this story ends, which I find really interesting, because what happens next is it says, the angel of the Lord also said to her, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, and with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall live at odds with all his kin. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, You are El Roi. For she said, have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? Therefore the well was called Be'er Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. Now, what does God give to Hagar?
Another nation.
God makes a covenant with Hagar that looks a whole lot like the covenant with Abraham. And there's something else here that I think is kind of interesting. So she named the Lord who spoke to her. Hagar, to the best of my knowledge, is the only person in the entire Bible who gives God a name. A lot of other places say they called upon the name of the Lord in this place or that place. But she gives God a name that is basically the God who sees me. And that's kind of remarkable. And I think she's the only person in the entire Hebrew Bible that gives God a name. Now let's move to the second episode, where they get sent away in Genesis chapter 21. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on that day, or on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. And that phrase is much debated. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abram rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, put it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba.
Okay, can I just say something?
Yes, ma'am.
Like, that is so wrong.
Oh!
On just so many levels. I mean, she's just completely lost her identity by going out. Yes, I know that God has made a promise to her, but just to the world, to society, she's completely lost her identity.
Okay. True. This painting, it's a little hard to see. I love this painting because it shows some emotion that the text just kind of wants you to skip over. Right? As Abraham was greatly distressed, but what about Hagar? And I love the look on Ishmael's face there, right? He's got a bow on his back, and we'll learn later he becomes proficient with a bow. But there's no doubt that a kid, this portrays him as being fairly young. But it's a question of how are they going to survive? And you see the emotion in this painting that I think it's really fascinating to see how different artists depict this story, because it gets depicted a lot in Renaissance times. This story bothers the people of the Renaissance, the artists of the Renaissance. They're like, what in the world is going on here? And it's this particular scene that bugs them. And they force you to dwell on it, more so than the text does. Now, when the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. And I suspect that might be a broom bush, like we saw in service today. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about a distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Do not let me look upon the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Why is that interesting?
She came from Egypt, so.
Okay, she came from Egypt, so she's gone and gotten him an Egyptian wife. Who's supposed to get the wives?
Husband.
The husband.
There is no husband.
So that's the question. Is she still Abraham's wife?
He cast her out.
Yeah.
Right.
He
So
sent her away,
he
but
sent
that,
away.
but does that mean she's no longer his wife?
Well, he did not just send her away. He could have set her up in an apartment. Care of his other son.
But you know, regardless, there's this phrase that you use. It's having agency. And that no matter what the rest of the story is that we don't know, that shows that she has agency.
Yes, yes. Now there's some other interesting things that happen in the story of Abraham that we often overlook a little bit, because it's not long after this, in fact it's right after this, that God tells Abraham, take your son, your only son, or the son whom you love, right? You know, and there's a whole rabbinic dialogue around about how the unspoken words of Abraham back to God at that point specifies that it's Isaac he's supposed to take, and he and Isaac go up the mountain, right, where Abraham pulls out the knife to sacrifice Isaac. The angel stops him. There's a very curious couple of things in the text. The text says they go up together, but it says Abraham comes down. It doesn't say where Isaac was. And the rabbis had a field day with this. And their view was Isaac didn't go back with Abraham. And not surprisingly, Isaac probably has a little bit of PTSD. Okay? And so rather than sleep with one eye open for the rest of his life, he apparently doesn't go back with Abraham. And what's more, the very next thing we see after Abraham's potential sacrifice of Isaac, is we get this very next line in the text. Sarah lived 127 years. This was the length of Sarah's life. And Sarah died at Kiryat Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abram went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Two things here. One is, the rabbis say, that what Abraham did to Isaac killed Sarah, because it's the next thing that happens in the text. The other interesting point is the place where Sarah dies is not the last place we see Abraham living. And so the idea that the rabbis have is that Sarah won't have anything to do with Abraham after he tries to sacrifice Isaac. She's living in a different place, and he goes to her to weep for her. But then we see something else really interesting in the text. This is when Isaac sees Rebekah for the first time. Now Isaac had come from Be'er Lahai Roi and was settled in the Negev. Isaac went out in the evening to walk in the field, and looking up he saw camels coming. And Rebekah looked up, and when she saw Isaac, she slipped quickly from the camel and said to the servant, "Who is the man over there walking in the field to meet us?" The servant said, "It is my master." So she took her veil and covered herself. Where is Isaac living?
The place where Hagar.
The place where Hagar named. So the question is, does Isaac leave and go live with Hagar and Ishmael? Because let's face it, someone else has experienced an ordeal with Abraham. It's Hagar. And then it gets even more interesting because it says when Abraham dies, his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abram purchased from the Hittites. There Abram was buried with his wife Sarah. After the death of Abram, God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac settled at Beher Lahai Roi, a place associated with Hagar. So my question is, what does Hagar's story teach us about female agency even under patriarchy?
Pretty powerful.
She's kind of a powerful woman, despite being named the foreign thing.
That's like,
She demonstrates agency. She receives a covenant like the patriarchs. She's the only person that gives God a name. She arranges marriage for Ishmael. And incidentally, when you look at the story, and this is something that Phyllis Tribble does really well, as much as she talks about how Hagar is terrorized in this text, Hagar's oppression becomes a type, a type for Israel's oppression in Egypt. It's oppression in reversed. Abraham is oppressing, Sarah is oppressing her, and an Egyptian. But when they go to Egypt, Israel will be oppressed by the Egyptians. Same word. So there's a lot of parallels that exist there. But I find Hagar's agency under patriarchy as a slave girl to be quite remarkable. And so when we think about patriarchy in a modern context, I think we need to look at it and say patriarchy in the Bible is not as conservative as patriarchy in our society today. So when we try to say, oh, our patriarchy is biblical, we need to be careful in that how we define patriarchy isn't the same way they defined it. Okay? These women had agency, and they exercised that agency in spite of, and sometimes with the blessing of, the men.
can you give us a really good description of what you mean by agency?
Agency is the ability to make decisions on your own. Okay? The authority to make those decisions. Sorry, thank you. That's
That's
yeah.
what I thought you were meaning by this,
Yes.
but I just wanted to make sure.
The ability
I
to
got it.
decide for yourself what you're going to do, and the power to do it. Yes, sir.
Does this odd question lead to the principles of the Mormons?
Say that one more time.
Does this lead to the principles of the Mormons to have multiple wives?
I'm not sure.
Mention of
So that
this
yeah.
in the
So
Testament.
I have a slide on my phone. I've been tempted to put it up in some of these discussions. We talk about biblical marriage. Okay. Biblical marriage. Let's just be honest. In the Old Testament, biblical marriage is not always between just a man and a woman. Okay, it's between a lot of different sets. It's man between multiple women. It's with the brother's wife after the brother dies, to make babies for the brother that died, to ensure the inheritance continues. There's all sorts of different ways in which biblical, if we use that term, marriage gets defined. Now, is this how the Mormons do it? I don't know if it's Mormonism to say, but it wouldn't surprise me. But the idea of a single man and a single woman is something that develops really after you move out of an agricultural society where you're not living on the land as much and dependent on multiple people to work it for the overall survival. That's really, the decisions are more about survival than they are about anything else. So,
I was just gonna say, it's
Yes.
just like, she was forced into that agency though.
yes, she was. She was
So-
forced.
so with the lack of what else do you do, if there's no one to do it for you, then you're gonna do it yourself.
You're going to do it for yourself. And I find that interesting, she's not condemned for it. They're never condemned for doing it for themselves. And I find that to be a really fascinating distinction. There's no criticism in the text for what she does. It's stated. So Sarah and Hagar, for me, are examples of women within biblical patriarchy that function within the roles that we would expect to see. Sarah exercises authority as matriarch, and Hagar functions in some ways both as patriarch and as matriarch, in that she receives a covenant, she names God, and she arranges marriage for Ishmael. And it also seems that she possibly becomes somewhat of a surrogate mother for Isaac if you carefully look between the lines in the text. You can debate that if you want, but there's certainly ample possibility for it, and early rabbis jumped all over it as a possibility. So next week, we're going to move out of the Old Testament. We're going to move to the New Testament. And we're going to look at Jesus and women. And in particular, I'm not going to give you a text to look at this week, but I'd like you to think about something, and that is the Roman Empire is a really, really, really large empire. How in the world did the Romans maintain control over such a vast empire? And I'll give you a hint, it's not with an army. So how did they do it? And we're going to find that it's something that plays really interestingly into Jesus and his ministry. So that's next week. Thank you all very much. We're actually on time this week. I can't believe it. We'll see you all next week.